In this episode, we take the assessment work through its last major deliverable, the final assessment report, which is where the organization captures what was found, what changed, what remains, and what decisions are being made as a result. The final report is not just a cleaned-up version of the initial report, because it has a different job. The initial report is often a first full draft that invites factual review and helps stakeholders orient to the findings, while the final report is a record that needs to stand up over time, including under external review, leadership turnover, or future audits. It must clearly communicate status, meaning where each finding ended up after corrective actions and reassessment. It must include recommendations that are practical and aligned to requirements and risk, without drifting into tool-specific instructions or unrealistic wish lists. It must also support closure, meaning the assessment effort itself ends with documented outcomes, responsibilities, and any open items managed deliberately rather than left floating. For beginners, it helps to think of the final report as the organization's official story about this assessment cycle, written in evidence-backed language that future readers can trust. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at CGRC.Me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A strong final report begins with clear continuity from the initial report, because readers need to understand what changed and why. That continuity comes from restating the assessment's objectives, scope, criteria, and time period, and then explaining what additional work occurred between the initial and final versions. This usually includes stakeholder review, evidence clarification, corrective action work, and reassessment validation. The point is not to narrate every meeting, but to show that the final conclusions reflect a disciplined process rather than a rushed rewrite. Continuity also includes confirming that the scope did not drift without documentation, because scope drift is a common way reports become misleading. If the scope changed, the final report should explain the change and why it happened, such as a newly discovered dependency or a formally approved exclusion. When this context is present, the report becomes defensible because it shows the reader the frame in which conclusions were reached. Without it, a reader might assume the report applies to the entire organization or to a broader system than was actually assessed. Clarity at the front prevents misinterpretation later. Status is the centerpiece of the final report, and status needs to be expressed in a way that is both understandable and evidence-based. A status statement should tell the reader whether a finding is resolved, partially resolved, unresolved, or accepted as residual risk, depending on the organization's terminology and governance model. The status must not be a feeling, such as we think this is better now, but a conclusion supported by verified and validated evidence. If a finding is resolved, the report should reflect that the requirement is now met and that the evidence shows both design alignment and operational behavior. If a finding is partially resolved, the report should explain what is in place and what is missing, often tying the missing element to time-based evidence that has not yet accumulated. If a finding remains unresolved, the report should explain why, such as incomplete corrective action or insufficient evidence, without turning the wording into blame. If a risk is accepted, the report should capture the acceptance decision, who accepted it, and any conditions or review dates that govern it. This status clarity is what makes the final report useful for governance, because it tells leadership what risk remains and what accountability remains. A practical challenge in final reporting is handling corrections and disputes that occurred after the initial report, because those changes must be reflected transparently without undermining credibility. If a finding changed due to new evidence, the final report should reflect that the conclusion was updated because the evidence set changed, not because someone argued loudly. This protects the integrity of the process and helps stakeholders trust that accurate evidence can influence outcomes. If a finding did not change despite disputes, the report should remain neutral and grounded, and it should avoid adding defensive language. The final report is not a debate transcript. It is a decision record. Still, it should be clear that factual accuracy was reviewed, because that improves confidence in the final deliverable. A mature report will also handle evidence limitations honestly, stating when conclusions are based on the best available information and what that means for confidence. That honesty is not weakness. It is part of defensibility, because reviewers trust reports more when they acknowledge constraints. Final reporting is about clarity, not perfection theater. Recommendations are another key part of the final report, and they need to be framed correctly for governance. A recommendation is not a configuration instruction, and it is not a list of products to buy, because those are implementation choices that depend on context. Instead, recommendations should describe what outcome is needed and what control improvement should accomplish, in a way that system owners can translate into action. For example, a recommendation might be to formalize and enforce a periodic access review process with documented approvals and exception handling, rather than telling a team exactly how to implement it. Recommendations should also be tied to risk and requirements, meaning the report should make clear why the recommendation matters and what it addresses. A common beginner mistake is to recommend generic best practices that are not connected to the findings, which makes the report feel like boilerplate. Another mistake is to recommend unrealistic changes that ignore resource constraints, which makes stakeholders dismiss the report. Strong recommendations are specific enough to guide action, but flexible enough to allow implementation choices. They should also be prioritized in a way that reflects risk, dependency order, and feasibility, so stakeholders can plan a realistic sequence of work. The final report should also connect recommendations to status outcomes, because not every finding needs the same type of recommendation. If a finding is resolved, the recommendation might focus on sustaining the improvement, such as maintaining cadence, monitoring evidence quality, or ensuring ownership remains clear. If a finding is partially resolved, the recommendation might focus on completing the remaining evidence and verifying routine operation over time. If a finding is unresolved, the recommendation might focus on clarifying scope, assigning ownership, securing resources, or redesigning the control approach to meet requirements. If a risk is accepted, the recommendation might focus on monitoring, periodic review, and conditions that would trigger reconsideration. This alignment prevents a situation where the report recommends large changes for issues that are already resolved or recommends vague monitoring for issues that require concrete fixes. It also helps leadership understand that the report is not just pointing out problems, but guiding the next steps based on the current state. When recommendations match status, the report reads like a coherent governance document rather than a disconnected mix of findings and advice. Closure is the third pillar of the final report, and closure has a specific meaning in governance. The assessment cycle ends with documented outcomes, and with open items transitioned into ongoing management rather than left in limbo. Closure includes confirming that deliverables were produced, that stakeholders reviewed results, and that ownership for ongoing actions is established. It also includes documenting what remains open, how it will be tracked, and what timeline or review mechanism applies. Beginners sometimes assume closure means everything is fixed, but that is rarely true, and pretending it is true undermines trust. A better view is that closure means the organization knows exactly what is resolved, what is not resolved, and what decisions have been made about residual risk. Closure is also where you confirm that evidence is stored appropriately and that traceability is preserved, because future assessments depend on a clear evidence trail. If the report will be used as an input for future audits or authorization decisions, closure includes ensuring it is finalized, controlled, and accessible to authorized readers. Closure is essentially the handoff from assessment work to ongoing governance work. A final report must maintain defensibility, and defensibility comes from consistent language, consistent standards, and clear evidence linkage. That means each finding should still show the requirement, the observed condition, and the evidence basis, even if the status has changed since the initial report. If the finding is resolved, the final report should reflect what evidence demonstrated resolution and what time window that evidence covers. If the finding is partially resolved, the report should reflect what evidence exists and what evidence is still needed. Defensibility also means being careful about absolute statements. If you only examined a defined scope, the report should not claim organization-wide compliance. If evidence limitations exist, the report should describe them in a way that shows how they affect confidence. Another part of defensibility is avoiding emotional language, because emotional language can make findings feel biased. A calm, precise tone makes the report feel like an engineering document rather than a complaint letter. When a report reads like it was written to be fair, it is more likely to be accepted and acted on. The final report should also demonstrate that the assessment process itself was controlled, because process quality affects trust in conclusions. This includes noting that the assessment followed the plan or documenting approved deviations from the plan and indicating that evidence was verified and validated. It also includes reflecting that stakeholder review was used to improve factual accuracy, not to dilute findings. When process control is visible, the report becomes easier for third parties to trust because they can see that the work followed a disciplined method. It also helps internal leadership because they can use the report to demonstrate governance maturity. For beginners, it is useful to recognize that a final report is a governance artifact that can be used in multiple contexts: internal risk management, external compliance conversations, and future assessments. That is why it must be written with care, because it will outlive the current team and the current set of stakeholders. A report that is clear and controlled becomes a stable reference point rather than a document people avoid. A subtle but important part of final reporting is setting expectations about what happens next without turning the report into a project plan. The report should make clear which items are closed and which items are open, and it should indicate the governance mechanism that will manage open items going forward. That might include reassessment dates, periodic monitoring, or integration into an ongoing risk register, depending on the organization's model. This helps prevent a common failure mode where the final report is filed away and the organization assumes the work is done. In reality, controls require ongoing operation and risks change over time, so governance needs a living process beyond the assessment. The final report should support that living process by pointing to the owners and the follow-up expectations. This also supports accountability, because leadership can reference the report to confirm that actions are progressing and that accepted risks are being reviewed. A good final report does not create a false sense of finality. It creates a clear transition from assessment to ongoing risk management. By the end of this topic, you should understand that developing the final assessment report is the discipline of producing a durable, defensible record that communicates status, provides actionable recommendations, and closes the assessment cycle responsibly. Status tells the organization what is resolved, what is partially resolved, what remains unresolved, and what is accepted as residual risk, all grounded in verified evidence. Recommendations guide next steps without becoming tool-specific, and they align tightly to both risk and the current status of each finding. Closure documents outcomes, preserves traceability, and transitions open items into ongoing governance so nothing is lost or forgotten. When a final report is done well, it becomes a trusted artifact that supports decisions, strengthens accountability, and makes future assessments easier because the story is clear. That is the real value of final reporting. It turns assessment work into a reliable record of progress and remaining risk, rather than a temporary burst of activity that fades as soon as the meetings end.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.